I just wanted to let you know you're about to listen to an interview that no matter which side of the aisle you stand on in terms of theology, no matter which side of the aisle you stand on with respect to sexual identity, you're going to find some things in this conversation that may go counter to the way you think, feel, believe. I want you to consider for a minute the fact that we have the privilege of, as Christians, having conversations when we don't always agree with each other. Jesus talked about Matthew 7, chapter 12, in everything, therefore, treat people the same way you want them to treat you, for this is the law and the prophets. We're about to listen to Brandon Flanery explain his life as an evangelical, former pastor, former missionary. He's an author, he's a journalist. I don't think everything's going to fit in your bucket, no matter which side of the aisle you stand on with this. But we owe each other the respect to hear, to try to understand, and to try to serve Christ together. So, in that spirit,
and to this day, I tell John that he has been a grandfather like I've never had one, and he's loved me in ways like a father that have been so healing for me. And those things have included seeking to understand, even though he's now in his 70s and has so much that he's learned and yet still wants to learn from me. And so it's something that I'm very humbled by with him, is that he seeks to understand. And I would say that I have good friends still in very evangelical Christianity. Some of them are involved in some mega churches. And that's my background, is non-denominational evangelical Christianity. And the thing that has been transforming, especially for those that don't agree, are those that seek to understand.
Hello everyone, I'm Dennis Allen. Welcome to the Disciple Dilemma. We first bumped into Brandon Flanery when Raymond discovered his article in Baptist News about why so many people are leaving the church. That was interesting to us as a discipleship conversation as we think about the disciple dilemma specifically. But even more interesting for us is that Brandon considers himself to be an evangelical. He's written a new book called Stumbling. He is both a journalist and an author, but he's been a pastor and a missionary. And the story he's got to tell us is all about why things didn't fit together and work for him in his walk with Christ, and where he is today, and how that relates to discipleship. Let's listen as Raymond and I have a conversation with Brandon Flanery, an evangelical and discipleship. Brandon, let me start out by thanking you for being with us on the Disciple Dilemma podcast. We are honored that you would be with us today.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
So, Brandon, I was the one who saw your article on Real Clear and thought it was really a compelling article about how the church is losing people because we really don't know how to grapple with the modern culture that we're in. We don't know how to deal with gender or sexual identity or a whole range of issues. How does someone that's just an ordinary traditional guy love a Brandon that shows up in his church?
I immediately think of someone that has loved me very well from a very traditional background. His name is John. He was a pastor for 30 years in Christian Missionary Alliance out of Chicago. We crossed paths as a result of an organization called the Crucible Project. And his son is gay. And when his son came out, even though he was a pastor for 20 years, the first thing that he did, even into his, I think at this point, 60s, he decided that he needed to care enough to learn. And so he bought books, he learned other perspectives. And by the end of it, he decided, I might be wrong. I had this opinion for all of my life, and I might be wrong. There are these theologians that have good information, that have studied this far better than I have, and I could be wrong. And to see, so then we crossed paths, and he shared that with me. And when we crossed paths, I was not even very affirming of myself, let alone someone else. I had recently come out of my first relationship. It didn't go well. And I had all these judgments around like what it means to be gay, or like it could have just been a bad relationship. But I have a habit of taking things to the extreme. And so I'm like, see, this is why you shouldn't be gay. This is why God said that in the Bible. And so I bumped into him at that time, and he was honestly more affirming of who I was than I was at the time. And to this day, I tell John that he has been a grandfather like I've never had one. And he's loved me in ways like a father that have been so healing for me. And those things have included seeking to understand, even though he's now in his 70s and has so much that he's learned and yet still wants to learn from me. And so it's something that I'm very humbled by with him, is that he seeks to understand. And I would say that I have good friends still in very evangelical Christianity. Some of them are involved in some mega churches. And that's my background, is non-denominational evangelical Christianity. And the thing that has been transforming, especially for those that don't agree, are those that seek to understand. And that's been probably the most healing thing, is when people actually want to listen and humanize something that I think, especially when it comes to LGBTQ issues, we view it as issues instead of seeing faces and names. And I think that the people where we're in such beautiful spaces of even holding tension where we don't agree, it's because of the fact that they see me, they don't see a gay man, they see Brandon Flanery. And I think that's what's been the most beautiful. I think of the other two people that really come through is my friend Andrew. I was not doing well, and he was just sharing, I don't know what to do at this point, because I know that you're wrestling with your faith, and like a piece of me wants to like offer prayer or like verses, but like I don't know that's where you're at. And the fact that he understood that, but then me saying, I know who you are, Andrew. I know you're a pastor. I understand that's how you love people. So please, like, love me with your prayer, love me with your verses. But he seeks to understand. And so does my friend Hannah. She, one thing that really humbled me is that she said, even though I have questions, I still see God's hand on your life, and I see that God, and I can't shake that. And so I'm going to live in that tension and say that maybe you're right, maybe I'm right. Most likely both of us are wrong, and we're not going to find out till we get to the other side. But I know that I can engage with you as a sibling in Christ. I think all those moments have really done a huge healing work for me, rather than someone that assumes that they know my story, rather than someone that assumes to know that they have the right answer, someone that refuses to listen. I think those have been the most hurtful when it comes to my coming out experience, especially with the church.
And one of the things I'm learning, having been married for over 40 years, is that when my wife is talking to me, she's not asking for me to respond. She's asking me to actually hear her, really listen to her. And that's a real challenge, because, that's not built into the way us guys really operate. And so that's a real challenge. I have to confess that I've read your draft book.
Great.
I confess that to you, so you know that I don't have. I know something about Brandon. I thought it was fascinating because it's in one sense autobiographical, but in another sense, it's really more psychological than autobiographical in terms of a chronological event kind of book. So it was really fascinating. But the thing that really struck me, and one of the things that I'm really, especially with what you've said so far, is you only find Jesus in the last 20 pages. So what's that all about?
I think what's so interesting to me is the idea of that's really interesting as someone reading in on this, and my relationship to it, because obviously I've been in the weeds with this thing for a while. I started writing a year and a half ago, because I guess there is this like return of trust to Jesus, to the divine, even in all those questions at the end. But what's interesting to me is that there's a moment, and I hint at it throughout, and now I'm curious which draft you have, but I feel like it would be in there. It's where I talk about there are these moments of coming up where I feel like God is chasing me, and I think that continues throughout. And so it's interesting where it's like I find Jesus, but I do really feel that God for me is throughout all of it. After my first coming back from overseas and leaving, being trapped in my car and feeling like God's talking to me there. Going on my first date with a man and feeling like God's talking to me there. And then there's a lot of big questions, especially after that, because I think that one thing that I really wrestled with and still wrestle with is, to use Jesus's words of, if this is true, why has been so much fruit with my engagement with the church been so horrible? And not just me, a lot of my queer siblings, and not just my queer siblings, but like, as a result of my sexuality, I started to tease some things out because I had to really investigate for myself some things. But I think big questions about, like, man, Christianity being attached to white supremacy and imperialism, like, how do I feel about that? And I didn't have those questions before, because, to be quite frank, I had a privilege to not have to. It didn't affect me directly. And then when my sexuality really came to the forefront, it brought up a lot of other questions. I don't know, because of the fact that I was really good at being like an evangelical Christian. Like I went to Bible school really early on. I was really passionate. Every Tuesday I was evangelizing on the streets of Berlin, like praying with people, strangers. Like went to Mumbai, did the same. Was a youth pastor for 3 years at 19. I don't know why a church decided to do that. I think irresponsible. But I was really good at all of that. Like from a purely what's what I'm looking for, like looking at the works of it all. But even my heart was in it. I loved it. And I didn't have to question it because it didn't, like, I was exactly the type of person that the flavor of Christianity that I come from was looking for. And until I didn't fit the mold, I think that I probably would have continued without analyzing my faith, because it didn't cost me anything. I'm just being really honest. I think that a lot of people, that's why someone like John really shook me, is that the story of his son didn't directly affect him in the sense of, yeah, it was his kid, but I know plenty of other parents that their kids come out and it doesn't change how they feel until something directly affects them, unfortunately. But he decided to research and learn because he was confronted with a different story that he didn't understand. For me, I don't know. I have a brother that is queer. And they came out, and I still didn't quite wrestle with it until I really started to come to terms with this for myself. And so it was, as a result of my sexuality, I had to really start teasing things out and wrestling through some things. And yeah, I think that there's a lot of moments where I am desperately running from God, to be quite frank, because I felt so hurt. Not just, yes, from Christians, but I think also, like, I had big questions for God that I felt like weren't answered. So I didn't want to talk to him.
One of the questions that I have in terms of both reading your book and what you've talked about, I think your experience is not that unique in terms of being gay. I think all of us who have been Christians have had those same kinds of disappointments, feelings of isolation, feelings of rejection, feeling of hypocrisy in the church. People that we knew and trusted turn out to be corrupt sinners just like we are. It's shocking. And so how much of it do you think really is sort of the modern ideas about supremacy and gay people, and how much of it is just the church has always been a mixed bag of corruption and genuine believers who love one another?
Yeah, I think one thing that's different for today is we have the internet. And
Agreed.
And I think it's probably been the biggest game changer for millennials down, because I grew up with, like, but yeah, the internet existed, but it wasn't really used every day. I remember my first like computer was that really chunky Mac, and it was Reader Rabbit on on floppy disk. Like, and I was like 5 years old when that came out. And so I think from millennials onward, we were raised with the internet as it was coming around, and Gen Z is very connected to it, more so than we are. And I would say that while all of these things have been there, I think a big game changer is you have this massive dissemination of information that people are now having to work with, versus before, a lot of narratives, for example, would be housed in like from higher ed, or they'd be from the pulpit, and they'd be disseminated out, versus now I can go online and I could, whether it be like a scholarly article that I could read myself, or I'm consuming content from a theologian who's just giving me information for their next research, I can consume that literally in minutes. And I think that my opinion would be that's probably been the biggest game changer. I think that, for example, Christianity connected to, I think a big thing right now, and a lot of that you see in my survey of like the research that I've done, is evangelicalism being really vividly connected to nationalism and politics.
Sure.
The word, I mean, that was the second, or let me pull up the results again really fast, but it's high up there for why people started to question leaving. And I think that what it instigated is not that those things have never been there, and now we're dealing with the connection of politics with faith, but realizing, being confronted with it kind of viscerally, and then kind of looking back and being like, well, I mean, Christians came to the Americas for like to spread the gospel and bring Christ. And so like, how do we reconcile that? And they also came to Africa and like did the same thing, and like to Asia. And so while we have a problem with it now, there's an echo of realizing, oh man, it's been there too. How do we sit with that? And people are finding different answers. Some people are leaving completely. Some people are wrestling it out. Some people are embracing different elements of spirituality, and some people keep what they have and they're just trying to be more informed. But I've seen very diverse solutions to that.
Brandon, I wanted to start out by asking you if you had 30 seconds in the elevator to explain stumbling to a baby boomer. I'm the guy on the elevator, never heard of stumbling before. Would you just give me let's call it a 30, 40-second speech on the book? What did you want me to take away? What do you want me to be haunted with as I read your book?
Yeah, I would say that it is a sassy memoir about coming out of evangelicalism in the closet, wrestling through big questions about who God is in the midst of coming out. It's a story of deconstruction, it's a story of wrestle, and it's a story of hope. Those would be my
Wow.
Very quick.
Wow. I wish other people that were associated with us on the podcast could answer questions like that. I'm not naming names.
I am in marketing, so I understand how you have to like distill things down.
You got it, man. You got the right stuff. You're cooking here. So let me explore this with you with a couple of follow-ups. First of all, would you give me a sense from your gut right now where you are on the difference between evangelicalism and being a follower of Christ? Is there anything different between those two in your world as you experience it today, as you're thinking about it today? Or is it one and the same and there's no difference if you think about those two terms, follower of Christ and an evangelicalist? What do you think?
I would say that they're different. And the reason I would say that is my own personal story. And also, again, going back to those surveys, I have a good chunk of people that refuse to be identified as an evangelical anymore, but they would literally use the phrase follower of Jesus when I ask them, how do you identify now?
Wow.
And I do think they're different. And I would say that the biggest things, the biggest difference for me that I see, I think of two books in particular, and that's Jesus and John Wayne and After Evangelicalism. I think both of those kind of are way better at this topic about evangelicalism, especially with Jesus and John Wayne, the history of where the term evangelicalism even came from and what that journey looks like. But my biggest thing for me when it comes to evangelicalism, I think that are some big differences and I would say, again, going back to that survey that I think people are fed up with, is this intertwining of faith with politics. I think that's honestly the biggest thing. There's so much more to it, but I would say that, again, looking at the data, that is the biggest thing. And I think that is why so many people started deconstructing in 2020, because you had very viscerally, worship pastors standing in the Oval Office, putting their hands on President Trump, and a lot of religious leaders coming behind that, and what if they disagreed, they didn't disagree very loudly. And I think that the boiling point would have been when the Black Lives Matter movement happened, and you had Christians who refused to listen to a group that were in pain and wanted to say all lives matter, when when the equivalent would be, I'm in pain, someone saying, well, other people are in pain too. And I think that people started to get a lot of my friends were shaken by that, saying, I thought that what I was raised with was a belief system that said, listen to those who are in pain, and Jesus came for the marginalized. But we have this group that is saying they're in pain, that they are marginalized, and we're sticking our fingers in our ears and we're saying, la, 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 we're not listening. And regardless if I agree or not, how could I align myself with people that refuse to listen? And so I would say that, again, in that survey, the term 2020 in particular was used a lot. And so, when it comes to politics, it was the sixth most popular reason for why people started to first question things. So I think that those two books, I would say, that tease out better than me, but that is, I would say, from like the common, typical human being that is walking away from evangelicalism in particular, it is because of the fact that it has been, I would say, co-opted by political parties, and they're tired of it. And they don't want to be associated with that anymore because it doesn't, in their opinion, look like Jesus.
I think that we would both be very comfortable with the idea of the co-opting of the evangelical mind. We go back to Schaeffer's book, The Great Evangelical Disaster, which was published in the late 70s, early 80s, and it was the same thesis. It just happened to be written then instead of the things we're saying today. I want to try out, I'm just going to say up ahead of time, I'm setting up a trap. So I want you to just be aware of that.
Right.
The first set of words that I want to put on the table are materialism and nationalism, and that evangelicalism has blended, in many cases, materialism, wealth is good, power is great, nationalism, power focused in a particular direction, regardless of the means used to achieve it, is very good, very wonderful, are very triumphal power plays by the evangelical church today, and are contra to Scripture. Would you kind of echo that's what you were just saying a minute ago?
I think it's an element for sure. I come from a background, I would say that it wasn't very loud, but I would my orbit would bump into those areas, so it was quite loud. I worked for a couple of mega churches in Texas while I was in Bible school. And I think this would be a more true of that flavor of church. And then in my flavor of church, like we're not as loud with it, but it's still there. But prosperity. It's, I think that a lot of Christian flavors that I come from, while they would never fully claim that they are prosperity gospel in word directly, subtext is all there. There's a hard time dealing with pain. There's a hard time dealing with injury. There's a hard time with troubles, because there's especially when I think of the mega churches I was a part of, it was a big kind of selling point for Jesus was follow Jesus and you will be blessed. Follow Jesus and you will prosper because you will then be able to bless the world. Like, we're called to be blessed so that we can be a blessing. That phrase in particular, we are called to be blessed so we can be a blessing. And then, this is like very visceral, but it's true. I was in those spaces. Then the pastor comes on stage in a brand new car, like that's like taking a caricature. I know that that's not all Christian, but I'm going to exaggerate a little bit because I do think that that's there. And I do think that when it comes to nationalism, a big phrase is God bless America. And I'm very curious how people think that how they're defining that. And I would say that while people may not out loud would say it, I do think that they would think material when it comes to being blessed.
So there's a certain degree of fear that constructs the religious view of Christianity that I in America want to construct, which is like, I need to be blessed, I need to be powerful, I need to be a celebrity, I need to have horsepower in the political systems, and I need to end up either in prosperity or in just the accumulation of wealth materially, given this entitlement in Christ. And if I don't get those things, then I'm very unhappy with the church. And that's a challenge, I think, that you're helping us to define here, which is that these kind of characteristics and attributes have parasitically attached themselves to the followers of Christ, and it has become culturally invisible but present in much of the evangelical community.
Yeah, I would agree with that, because I even think from a pop culture perspective of like, I'm going to play my cards here. I'm going to come off as probably not very educated with this. I love TikTok. I love it so much. I love engaging with it. I get off of that social media and I feel happy, unlike literally any other social media. And I understand that there's critique to the algorithm and all that stuff, but I think about those spaces that I find myself in as a result of the content I'm putting out there and the writing that I have with this book. And I think of a critique that I see often from the masses. Obviously, it's not an educated critique. It is literally from someone who's just pulling out their phone. But it's the idea of Jesus and the early church sound a lot like socialists. And so they would critique that with like the left versus, and then they would like continually kind of pivot to an example being, why did the church just, these organizations just pay $20 million to advertise during the Super Bowl? Couldn't that have been spent on the poor? Like that, those are the types of conversations that you'll hear in very, again, we're not talking about like the theologian or the pastor. We're talking about the everyday Joe that is wrestling through leaving Christianity or has left and is saying, why was money spent on that?
So here's the second swing of the door.
There's the trap part.
This is the trap, right? Heads up. Everybody's aware, right?
Yeah.
On the one hand, I would say that I personally, as a follower of Christ, am following with a hack in my software that says I don't even notice the nationalism, the materialism, the experientialism, the issues that we've just been trafficking about. My question to you is, how blind is the gay Christian community to sensualism? Much as I would ask the question of someone who would say they are polyamorous, would say, I can be a believer and be polyamorous, I can be a believer and be gay. Is there a biblical case for the follower of Christ to say, you know, I'm not sure that I'm really all that aware of my own sensuality taking a higher stance in my discipleship versus his materialism or his prosperism or his power structure and his nationalism? How about it, Brandon? Do you think that that's possible in the gay community of believers?
I think there's plenty of people that's the case. I will say this. This is not for me, because I would even argue that there are plenty of days that, you know, me throwing out Christianity for a while, I was just like, I'm going to have a good time. I'm not even sure if there's an afterlife. So I'm going to, if there's a cute boy, I'm going to make out with this cute boy. Like they're very much so like sensualism. Absolutely. So I'm not going to go ahead and hoist myself up here as this beacon of refrain. That's not my journey. And that's not my story, as you read from the book. And so, but I have, as a result of my process, have experienced gay Christians who have deeply humbled me. Especially, I'm going to go to this kind of middle ground, then I'll move over, but some language in that gay Christian space, you're going to hear side A, B, X, A, B, Y, X. And it's how someone is relating to their sexuality while reconciling scripture. Side X is pretty self-explanatory in the sense of trying to become ex-gay. And you'll see some stories like that, like the changed movement would consider themselves ex-gay. Side Y is going to be, you do not identify with your sin. You have same-sex attraction. You are not gay. And just like Paul had a thorn in his flesh, you will struggle with this till the day you die like an alcoholic. That'll be side Y. Side B, and these are the people that have deeply humbled me, and I will also move to side A, but side B, there are, I would argue, thousands of individuals who understand and have come to terms with the fact that their sexuality is not going to change, and that they will own that God made them that way, and that they are called to celibacy. And those people they are literally the opposite of sensuality in the sense of they are confronted with these yearnings every day and continue to say no.
Like a Sam Alberry, for example.
Sure. Yeah. I actually don't know who Sam Alberry is. So who is that individual?
Sam Alberry is a pastor from Europe. He's very popular with the Gospel Coalition and talks about the fact that he is absolutely your side B guy. I am drawn to, and I am gay. I am chaste. This is who I am.
Yeah. Okay. And I'll take ownership in the sense of side B. For me, I went from side X. I thought that I was good to go, kind of dabbled in side Y. And then when my faith started to fall apart, just jumped all the way over to, well, I don't care. So like, and I wouldn't say that's not all side A people, but that's where I went. But it wasn't really about reconciling scripture. It was just, I'm going to live my life because I'm not sure if scripture is even valid. Other people, though, I think of my friend Nick, who stayed identifying side B for so long because he was so scared of hell and so scared of that. Even if he was faced with like all these like books from theologians about how like the six clobber passages, like how they aren't actually talking about same-sex relationships. It's talking about power dynamics and the purchasing of a slave and conquest. He would listen to that and he would still say, I would rather be safe than sorry. And I saw him commit to his church week after week, day upon, like not even just one day a week. Like he was a volunteer in the church in youth ministry. He gave, I would say, 3 or 4 days a week to his church. Was honest with his journey. He would identify as gay. He would say that he's celibate. And he finally, after years of wrestling with this, decided to make the switch to just start dating. Nothing else changed. He just started dating men. And the reaction of the church that he gave his blood, sweat, and tears for was just horrible. And yet he continued to give them grace. He continued to show up week after week, answering all their questions that they are not asking straight couples who are dating. And yet he continued to stay with them. And he has, he's in a monogamous relationship. He is living as best he knows how in this tension of dating men. And he would say that he would now land with, it's no longer a sin. But people who have sat and held space with the Bible, again, I'm not going to say for myself, again, you've read my book, but these people who have journeyed with it and have wrestled with it are some of the most, they give me a lot of hope, because I see how they've succumbed to a lot of pain from the church and continue to say that I dare to believe.
Yeah. Folks, we're talking to Brandon Flanery, who has been a pastor. He's been a missionary. He is an author. He is a journalist. We've been reading some of his articles in the magazines. And he's got a new book, Stumbling, a Sassy Memoir about coming out of the closet and evangelicalism. This is the conversation that we want to keep up with. And Raymond's going to carry the freight in the next set of questions so we can probe a little deeper about his story, Brandon's story, and why we all need to pay attention. Stay with us.
I gave you the vocational stuff a few minutes ago, which I think is really critical. But one of the things I wanted to ask you was, you came up in a sort of Pentecostal charismatic background.
Yeah.
And yet, and a lot of the frustrations and limitations that we even talked about today in evangelicalism are not present in Catholicism or Lutheranism or Anglican. Have you ever done those places? Because I mean, they make it a point to accept a wide range of people and have a much looser theology that allows people that have all kinds of backgrounds and lifestyles to be part of the church and accepted wholly. Are they better at it than evangelicals?
I'm not going to say I've dabbled a ton. I have dabbled. I went to an Episcopalian church a couple weeks ago, and I told my Catholic friend, I go, it was lovely, but I couldn't get behind all the what was the exact word that I used? The show. I think I said show, which I don't necessarily like. I would on a podcast, but I did say the fanfare is what I said. I go, the fanfare was a little bit hard for me. I didn't like a golden cross walking up and down the aisle and a golden bye walking up and down the aisle and a priest throwing water on me. Just being really direct and honest with my Catholic friend. I do love the annual journey of liturgy. I think it's something that I did not experience growing up, and I so appreciate it. So I've gone to some spaces that are really beautiful, kind of like synthesize a couple of things. I think the most comfortable space for me that I've been in, that's Christian flavor, is there is a group of churches called With Collective, and in short, they all come from pretty previous like evangelical spaces. And they started to move towards being more affirming and inclusive, so much so that you could be LGBTQ and be on leadership, and then also really taking a critical look around conversations like around race. And when they both started doing that, when all of them started doing that, a lot, whether it was they lost their denominational endorsement or they lost congregants, a lot of them went through the ringer and they were all isolated. And I don't know the exact story of who found who, but eventually they started to kind of get arm in arm with each other and support each other since they didn't have denominations to help them.
Brandon, it's been an absolute delight. I've been looking forward to this. One of the things I think is in God's providence, he brings different people into your life. And the goal is not to persuade them or win the argument. It's for me to learn. And I've learned a lot from listening to you. What's the one thing, after hearing this whole range of conversation, what's the one or two things you want me to remember, to take away from this conversation so that I'm better at loving people like Brandon?
I mean, I honestly think it'd be the biggest thing is that first question that was asked. And that is, I think, and that connects to when you bump into difference, I think it's better to be curious than judgmental.
Agreed.
And that's something that I am also learning, because I realize that my judgment has turned on its head. And part of my journey has been not armoring up and protecting myself with judgment by judging evangelicals and saying I am not safe and they are not good and I know better. Because I think that is I took the same formula and now put it over here. And I want to undo that and say, okay, for example, this moment in my book where it's like, I'm surrounded by a bunch of evangelical middle-aged men and I'm terrified because I'm making a judgment that I'm not safe with these people. I've been pleasantly surprised that my judgments are wrong. And for me, I think the biggest thing when it comes to loving someone who is different than you is to be curious rather than judgmental.
Brandon, as we wrap up, my question for you would be, would you describe for the people listening to this, I'm going to make an assumption about the people listening for just a moment. They are straight church attending people who don't understand the world of someone who you described in the middle of your book. I want to know if you would help us understand, what are the LGBTQ folks who are sitting in the pews or wondering whether they should even wander in the doors, thinking and feeling as they come in, so we can understand how their world looks and feels to them. Can you put us in their shoes with a few words there?
First off, I will say that there are LGBTQ people in your pews, period, whether you want them there or not. Chances are, if they're there, they're a young kid growing up and they're figuring it out. And they are, if they're like me and if they're like my friends, they are hopeful but scared. Because for all of us, while we can critique the church, it offers something really beautiful when it comes to community. And yeah, even in those surveys, like there's this critique of, but was it good community if the community was conditional? And that is a question. But at the end of the day, a lot of us received a lot of belonging and purpose in the church. And we are terrified that if we share that we are in what we believe is the enemy, that we're going to be on the outside of the door. And when it comes to coming out, it's not this glorious or exciting thing. Especially if you're in that space, it is this terrifying thing. But eventually, the pressure builds so much so that you can't keep it in. And when that moment comes and you decide to essentially jump off the cliff, there's a panic of what is going to happen next. Are my friends going to accept me? Am I going to be allowed at the church? Am I going to be asked out to coffee by the pastor saying they want to catch up? And then I'm going to be jumped and asked, I'm scared for your soul. Is that going to happen? Or is this church going to try to understand? Is this church going to try to understand not only me, but maybe, like my friend John did, pick up a book and at least entertain the idea that their opinion might not be right? Because if someone is willing to even do that, I've had friends we've not landed on the same side of this, but if I had friends who are willing to even do that, I have felt loved and cared for, because it communicates that I am worth your time, that I'm worth your energy, to be understood. But when someone comes out and the reaction is, I know the answer to this is wrong, and you don't have ears to hear or a heart that is willing to break with your congregants or the person sitting next to you in the pew, it communicates what mattered the most was not my heart, but it was my attendance and my money. But if my heart matters to you, then communicate it, please, by at least seeking to understand. And if at the end of the day we part ways, great. Also put it on your website so that queer people can know to not go to that church. I anytime I see a church that says we welcome everyone, I have big suspicions, because all of us, the vast majority of us, are so scared that we're going to get jumped again from a evangelical, that they say that they want to meet up, that they say that we're welcome. And then when we meet up, they have a printout of all the verses that say that we're wrong. Or we go to church, and sure, we have attended a couple of times, but then we ask to volunteer and we're not allowed in the children's ministry. I think that a church can do the best by being curious and trying to understand there's going to be queer people here. But then probably the next best thing they can do is, after they have sought to understand and they have tried to be, and they have been curious, to be very clear about what their stance is and what their process is, so that people who are in their church can know if they should stay or not, or if those who are trying to come to their church can make an informed choice on whether they should go or not.
Great. Would you tell folks a little bit about when is Stumbling coming out, and how can we find out more if we were to track you on social media? And folks, I'm asking a guy to be open about his life. And so if some of you are feeling like, well, Brandon doesn't think exactly the way I think, if this isn't curiosity about understanding, then just get lost, right? But here's the main thing. How, Brandon, do we find out more about Stumbling? When's it coming out? And how do we reach you on social media to learn a little bit about what's going on in your world?
Absolutely. If all goes according to plan, Stumbling should be coming out June of this year, 2023. To learn more about me, you can go to brandonflanery.com. I do blog posts there. I do my weird investigative journalistic stuff there. I get fixated on data and post that there. So all that's there. Also, my social media stuff is there. But also my social media handle for Instagram is FlanBran. For TikTok, it is Brandon DL Flanery. And for Twitter, it is bflan2690. I wish they were all the same, but that was not possible.
So folks, you're seeing those headlines for each one of those citations, both website, TikTok, and all of them up on screen right now. And here's a look at the book. Book cover is coming out mid-23. Brandon Flanery, thank you for being with us today on the Disciple Dilemma.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the conversation and appreciate the two of you.
Yeah, thank you, Brandon. It was great.
And we would very much appreciate it if you would help us by following us on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, and the RSS feeds. Please subscribe. Please let us know you're out there. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for listening to this podcast.